Good morning and welcome. This is 10 Years Hence. Our focus this morning moves from global trends shaping the long term future to the seemingly intractable issue of global mass migration. David Robinson is a former Assistant Secretary of State, now retired, United States Ambassador to Guyana, and a lecturer in the Jackson School of Global Affairs at Yale University. Ambassador Robinson retired from the United States Foreign Service in 2017. He served as an American diplomat for more than 3 decades, principally in conflict zones and developing countries, including Afghanistan, Bosnia, and El Salvador. As acting Assistant Secretary of State for Population, Refugee, and Migration, and more recently as Assistant Secretary of State for Conflict and Stabilization Operations, he focused on forced migration and refugee crises and immediate post-conflict stabilization challenges in, among other places, Somalia, Venezuela, and Syria. Ambassador Robinson graduated from the University of Notre Dame in 1977 and is currently a lecturer at Yale University. Ladies and gentlemen, please help me welcome back to the Notre Dame campus Ambassador David Robinson.
Thank you very much. And good morning, everyone, and thank you all for being here. And thank you, Professor, for inviting me to join you here today. I very much appreciate it. It really is always nice to come back to Notre Dame, and as you just reminded me, I graduated a half century ago almost, which is just astonishing to me. I remember walking around campus, especially on football weekends, and seeing all the old guys wander around and wonder why they were still here, and now I'm one of them. And so it's a little bit humbling in my estimation. What I'd like to talk about today is migration, which would include immigration and mass migration, and really try to think about it with you. I hope we can eventually have a discussion about this, about why something that is so central to our national identity, that has been sort of the signature piece of the United States for 247 years or so, why it is so divisive, why particularly immigration is something that has, especially in the last 2 presidential campaigns or the last cycles, has driven us and even families into warring camps where both sides seem intent on blaming the other for trying to destroy America rather than trying to understand each other. And I find that to be troubling. And I don't think there's a right answer to it, but I think it's something that needs to be discussed to see why we're at this place. But before we do that, I would like to tell you a quick story. Today's an anniversary. On April 21st, 1999, exactly 24 years ago today, Vice President Al Gore, then Vice President, announced from Ellis Island in New York Harbor, which was the gateway for about 16 million immigrants into the United States, that the United States would accept 20,000 refugees from Kosovo for resettlement. Now, these were people who had fled Serbian President Slobodan Milosevic's ethnic cleansing campaign. These were the people who were victims of mass murder, or their families were the victims of mass murder, of mass deportations, of rape as a weapon of war, and they had fled toward Macedonia, and they were housed principally in 2 camps on the border between Macedonia and Kosovo. And the camps were named Stenković I and Stenković II. The camps were designed initially for 5,000 or 6,000 people. At this point, there were 30,000 people or more, and about 5,000 arriving every day. So the government of Macedonia was very concerned about this. They didn't want all these Kosovars coming into what was for them already a fraught situation. They had enough political problems on their hands, and they were threatening to close the border and say, no more can come in, that's it. So the United States and a few other countries said, listen, what we will do is go in and we will take a number of them off the camps, get some of the pressure off of Macedonia to let you know we're in this together, if you'll keep the border open and let people get away from the violence. So this was how the United States was going to make good on it. 2 days before the vice president made his announcement, I had just flown back from Africa. I'd been spending time on the border of Kenya and Somalia at a camp called Dadaab. And the day before the speech, I got a phone call from the Assistant Secretary of State in charge of refugees at that time. This is a quote. This is what the Assistant Secretary said to me. She was this fantastic woman who had been the head of a number of refugee organizations before. She was really a dynamic person. She's unfortunately passed. But I picked up the phone, it was in the morning, and she said, "David, tomorrow from Ellis Island in New York Harbor, Vice President Gore will announce that we are taking 20,000 Kosovars for resettlement into the United States. Go to Kosovo and bring back 20,000 Kosovars." That was my instruction. That was the extent of my instruction. Go to Kosovo and bring back 20,000 people. So, so I gathered the team together, and off, there were only about 3 of us, and off we flew to Kosovo, and eventually we got the whole thing to work. We actually, within about 6 weeks, brought, I think, 17,000 into the United States. But one afternoon, when I had been working in the camp for a while, I had to leave to go get something. And as I walked toward my car, something made me turn around. And I turned around and I looked at the fence. There's a chain link fence where all the refugees were kept. And standing at the fence was a little boy, probably 10 years old, and he had his fingers through the chain link. And he didn't look particularly distressed. You know, he wasn't in terrible shape or anything like that, and he just stared at me. And I stared back at him for just a minute, and then my reaction to seeing this little boy there was not just sort of overwhelming empathy or sympathy. There was empathy there, yes. But my reaction was just utter outrage that this child was put into that position. It's a horrible thing to do. And that anybody would have done this to thousands of these people. And then not only did he have to escape the carnage that became his home, when he made it to safety, he was treated like a criminal. You know, he's put behind a fence. Yes, he's being cared for. The international community was doing the very best it could do. But this is no life for a 10-year-old boy, right? So that shaped my thinking about refugees for a long time. Now, the problem is, when I look at the southern border of the United States, where we have our own mass migration issues today and have had for some time, I don't have the same feeling. I don't have the same sense of outrage. I have some empathy, but I don't want to leap in and go to work the way I did when I was in Kosovo, in Macedonia. I have a very different reaction to it, which I find disturbing for me. I wonder what that says. Because after all, we are an immigrant nation, right? The United States has always been an immigrant nation. Immigration continues to sustain us. I mean, just as a checkpoint, in Virginia's Arlington County public schools, 80 languages other than English are spoken. In New York City public schools, 150 languages other than English are spoken. And yet we haven't created a Tower of Babel. We have a country that works. We move forward out of this. It's a good news story. And we are proud of our immigrant heritage. In fact, before I came over here today, I looked at the Gallup polls 2023 U.S. attitudes on immigration, and fully 70% of those who were polled said, yeah, we think overall immigration is a benefit. We have problems. I mean, we want to look at the numbers and some other things, but overall, yes, we're an immigrant nation. We think that's a very good thing for us. And on top of that sort of just general view of immigration, I think many of us sort of have our own story of the immigrant who made good, and that sort of polishes up the thing. I know I do. One of my real privileges when I was the Assistant Chief of Mission at the U.S. Embassy in Kabul, Afghanistan, in 2013 and 2014 was participating in naturalization ceremonies for U.S. service members, foreign-born service members who were becoming citizens. And on July 4th, I think it was 2014, right after the ceremony, a young Marine Lance Corporal came up to me, a young infantryman came up to me, and he said, were you in Dadaab about 15 years ago? And I said, yeah, I was in Dadaab about 15 years ago. And he said, yeah, so was I. And then he stopped for a second, he looked at me with a big smile on his face, and said, and now I'm an American too. Right? So what struck me about that is that this young Somali-born Marine had already done more for his country, had volunteered more, sacrificed more, risked more for this country than 90% of native-born Americans will ever volunteer to do or be asked to do. That's, I think, who we want. I mean, that's a great American. It's a great American success story to have that young man here with us. So it bothers me when I don't immediately have this welcoming reaction to this large number of people on the southern border, because the IOM, the International Organization for Migration, estimates that there are about, I think it's 280 million people living in countries other than the country in which they were born today, migrants and immigrants. And of those 280 million, about 30 million of them are survival migrants. That would be refugees and asylum seekers, and people who are trying to flee generalized violence or social upheaval, like the folks at the 5 million or so that left Venezuela. And on our southern border, clearly, some number of the people there are survival migrants, just like that little boy in Kosovo was. So why is my reaction different to that? And to try to figure that out, I realize what made me nervous about it is there's another story we tell about immigrants in the United States, and it's not as optimistic, as uplifting as the story of the Marine Lance Corporal. And, well, I can give you an example. So what Benjamin Franklin said about German migrants in Pennsylvania in the mid-18th century, and I think I should give a trigger warning for language that is, by our standards, certainly remarkably unself-aware and nativist and probably racist. But here's what Benjamin Franklin said about Germans coming to the country. Franklin said, "Why should Pennsylvania, founded by the English, become a colony of aliens who will shortly be so numerous as to Germanize us instead of us Anglifying them, and will never adopt our language or customs any more than they can acquire our complexion?" Now, Franklin thought that Germans and Italians and Swedes and the French, and basically anybody who wasn't British, was, his word, swarthy looking or tawny, and therefore was unreliable and probably dishonest. And that was about the nicest thing he said about most migrants at the time. That's not that unusual for us. 2.5 centuries later, here's what Donald Trump said as he cruised down on his golden escalator to launch his campaign in 2015. And Donald Trump said, "The US has become a dumping ground for everybody else's problems. They're bringing drugs, they're bringing crime, they're rapists." That's what he said about Mexicans. When he actually got into the Oval Office, he doubled down on this. And what he said about migrants from Haiti and African countries, and again, a warning about language here, which this time includes some profanity, but it's part of the public record. And what then President Trump said, not candidate Trump said, is, "Why are we having people from all these shithole countries come here? We should have more people from places like Norway." I think that speaks volumes. But the point here is that I think those attitudes aren't so isolated. I think we do have a bifurcated view of immigration. On the one hand, we're a country proud of immigration. On the other hand, we're not so sure about migrants. And we've never been so sure about migrants. We've always had a sort of hesitancy. It's one thing to look at the little boy in Kosovo and say, my heart goes out to you, I want to help you, and I can help you, when he's not at my border. When he's at my border, I have a different initial response. That's just an honest statement. So I'm trying to figure out why that is. So in part, trying to answer that question, there's a professor at Oxford University called Alexander Betts. And he's one of the foremost thinkers about migration in the world. And he writes in his 2017 book, Refugee, that he likes to engage in a thought game with his students. And what he says is, listen, imagine that you're sitting at home on an evening, a dark and stormy night, and there's a knock on the door. And you go to the door, and you open the door, and there's a person you don't know standing there who says, I want to come into your house. And you say, okay, why? And the person says, well, you know, my house is kind of ugly, and my furniture is not very good, and my appliances don't work really well, and yours are really nice, so I want to come into your house. So the person, the homeowner, is likely to say, no, I don't think so. You know, I have different plans. You're probably not going to come into my house right now, and has the absolute right to say that. It's her house. She can say no. But now imagine that there's a knock on the door, and you get up and you answer the door, and there's a person standing there, and she says, I need your help. My husband is drunk again. He said he's going to kill me. He tried to kill me last time. Protect me, right? You will probably let the person into your house at that point and try to help. You'll call the police, do whatever you have to do. But two very different scenarios, right? So you reserve the right to decide who comes into your house. And that's what we do normally with migration. So my first tour in the Foreign Service, like most Foreign Service officers, was as a consular officer. And the way we exercise that right to decide who comes in is through our visa categories, our refugee protocols, our asylum guidelines, and a whole bunch of other strategies that we have, or programs that we have, to try to discern who we want to come in and who we prefer not to come in to the house. My first assignment was in the Dominican Republic. There were, I think, 15 of us on the visa line, or 12. And we had a refusal rate hovering between 80 and 90%. You know, we were not the welcome wagon. Our job was to say yes and no. We reserved the right to do that, which seems reasonable to me to do that. Let's go back to Professor Betts's scenario and play with it for just a second and say, let's suppose there's a knock on the door, and when the homeowner opens the door, there isn't a person standing there, there's a busload of people standing there that she's never seen before. The porch is groaning under the weight of humanity. There's just tons of people there that she doesn't know who they are. What's her reaction to that going to be? Well, her reaction to that's going to be, get off the porch. First, you know, all of a sudden, she's not looking at an individual trying to assess, do I need to help this individual? Right now, she's worried about the safety and security of her house, her family, all of those things. She doesn't have the opportunity at that point to make the kind of decisions that are rational, thought out, that try to marry her sense of humanitarian obligation with her responsibility to keep her home safe and secure for her family. She just wants the people to move off her porch and come up in a more orderly way so she can make these decisions. Well, I mean, the analogy is a bit tortured, but that's kind of what happens with mass migration. And so when you get a huge number of people assembled in one place and you don't have the resources to address them, and they're coming across the border, you're not talking about immigration policy anymore. And that's why we're having this fight, I think, is not because we disagree on immigration. We don't. We disagree on numbers, okay. We can disagree on a few ways that we manage immigration, but as a nation, we agree on immigration. We're not fighting about that. What we've been fighting about for the last many years is border control. That's a whole different story, because you have the unilateral right, the sovereign right, to control your border. There's no question about that. And what we're looking at is a border that seems insecure to many people, and that drives us into two separate camps. If you have the immigration liberalizer camp, I'll put it that way, they're going to blame the miss at the border on laws and resources that are far outdated, and they are. We need better rules. We need better categories of people. We need to figure out a better way to manage this decision-making process. Where 25 years ago, we weren't thinking about climate change and climate refugees. Well, today we are. But the laws haven't caught up with that. So the people who are very much on the more liberalizing side are blaming the laws for being archaic and the processes for being archaic. And they've got some truth on their side. Then you have the people who are kind of the more anti-immigrant zealots, I suppose, and they're saying, the heck with that. The problem is we've got a porous border, and this is about law and order, and I want to close the border. And so what you do is you push people back with things like the euphemistically named Migrant Protection Protocol, the MPP, better known as Stay in Mexico, and you push them into Mexico. Or use Title 22, which was the public health exclusion during the COVID pandemic, and you extend that to push people back. You can do that, but you're also breaking US law when you do it. Because US law says that a person has the right to cross a border without documentation to ask for asylum, right? If you deny the person the opportunity to ask for asylum, you're technically, at least, in violation of our statutes. Now, executive orders change that, so we push people back across the border. But as long as we're discussing border control, I think 10 years hence, we're gonna be right where we are today, because we ain't talking about migration. We're talking about border security. That's a whole different topic. And I think it's one that we really ought to talk about. Because immigration concerns, migration concerns, and they're related, obviously, that can never be, ever, a unilateral issue. By its very nature, that's a multilateral issue. You have to have relationships with other countries. You have to work out a protocol with other countries if you want to have any hope of controlling this, and not just controlling the number of migrants that come to your porch, to your border, but assuring that the migrants' human rights, which we signed off on, by the way, the universal human rights, are being protected, that their dignity is being protected, that their health and safety are being protected along the way. That's not happening today. So, well, I mean, this is a sad but true case. I don't know if any of you are watching the CNN special now about the migrants coming up through the Darien Gap from Colombia into Panama and then up to the United States. Several years ago, I was sent to Panama to address the issue with my Panamanian counterparts. And I'm sure they've changed the policy now. But we were discussing this, and I said, well, so what do you think? What are we going to do about this? You know, we've got these thousands of people coming up here, and it's a mess, and they're going through just hell to get here. So how are we going to address this? His answer, this is also a quote, his answer was, you want to know what we do? I'll tell you exactly what we do. This is what he said. We give them a bucket of Kentucky Fried Chicken, a bus ticket, and say the US is that way. That's not effective migration protocols. That just moves the problem along and makes sure that these people who are already vulnerable are subject to greater risk at every border they cross, right? So you can't do it on a unilateral basis. Now, in 2015, I think, or 16, at the United Nations General Assembly, all 193 member states signed on to a thing called the New York Declaration. And the United States signed on to it as well. And it was a framework, and among other things, it said in 2018, you should come up with a compact, a migration for safe, orderly, and regular migration for people, right? Well, when there was a change of administrations, the United States reneged on the New York Declaration, and then it did not sign the compact. And the reason it didn't sign the compact was because of sovereignty. And they said that this compact is going to compromise our sovereignty. Well, there's nothing in an international compact that has the capacity to compromise your sovereignty. It's not a legal document in that sense. It is an aspirational document, and what it does diplomatically is it gives you a framework to have discussion about it, to try to harmonize certain rules, like the rules of return. If you're going to return a migrant to their home country, You don't just throw them back across the border, back into a violent situation. You should have some kind of a system set up to assure their safety, their health, and these other things. And this is what the compact tried to accomplish. But we didn't sign on to the compact. There are only 5 countries didn't sign the compact. We were one of the 5, along with Hungary, which doesn't put us in great company in this kind of an issue. So again, we're stuck looking at a border saying, well, that's immigration. It's not, it's border control. Well, now with the new administration, they have, in December, I guess, of 2021, they said, yes, we are going to relook at the compact, and we're going to try to work with other countries to make the terms of the compact more realistic and work. And what you're looking at in these things, again, is trying to set up certain protocols for migrants as they go from place to place. One of the most important things is legal identity. Most of these folks don't have documents or documents that any other country recognizes. So you want to make sure that they have a legal identity. Why? Well, think of the millions of migrants who left Venezuela and went into Colombia. Now, that's a success story. Colombia followed, as did all the countries of South America. They followed the compact, and that worked. And what happened was they did recognize documents. They issued documents, which meant that people who were on the road or staying temporarily in a place, or even thinking of staying forever, could open a bank account. They could transfer cash. They could send cash. They could rent a house. If they needed to, they could get a job. They could access certain health requirements. You can't do that if you're not a human being, and you're not a human being unless you have a piece of paper that says you are one. You're not a legal person. So it's things like that that this compact is trying to accomplish. And I think that that's the discussion that we should be having. I think we can have that discussion again. But I think it's very important that we distinguish, as we think about migration, mass migration, and immigration, between border control, which is our sovereign right to control, and migration, which by its very nature is a multilateral issue over which we bear some responsibility for making sure that not only are we protecting state sovereignty and the rights of states, but also the health and the well-being of the migrants themselves. Right now, we're not doing a very good job with that. So my hesitation when I looked at the southern border, I don't think was based on Benjamin Franklin or former President Trump's concerns. I think it was this is a border issue, and I want to make sure the border gets controlled. That's as an old diplomat, that's what you do. But the way you do it is not by dumping people back into the same problem that they had before. There are other ways to handle this. And I think that's where the discussion has to go and has not yet gone there. So that's what I've seen. I'd love to hear any comments or thoughts that you all have on this.
All right.
Thanks, Jim.
Let me get a microphone. All right, very good. So let me begin with you. It was, David, thank you very much. It was 20 years ago that we had Ron Mazzoli on this stage. Ron's recently deceased wonderful Notre Dame kid who was half of Simpson Mazzoli, which is, to the best of my knowledge, the latest form, the most recent form of immigration legislation to come through the Congress.
That's right.
And when I brought Ron in here, he was a retired congressman, and Simpson Mazzoli was in his rearview mirror, so that goes back even further. So let's begin with a question about legislation, and I know this is highly speculative. Is there anything in the House or Senate that is moving through committee? Are there any advocates or champions for intelligent reform?
I think there are champions for it. I would say, Senator Kaine is certainly one of them from my old state of Virginia. So there are people who actually see this as an issue. The last several pieces of legislation crashed and burned. And they never made it through one body or the other. Usually the House is the body that stopped it. So I'm unaware now of anything that's new. What I am aware of is the administration's written stated intent to begin trying to follow the compact and try to make the compact into the model document that I think any legislation that is written is going to have to take into account, because it lays out quite well, I think, some of the obligations that we ought to willingly accept.
We used to have a lottery system on
Sure.
green cards and a path to permanent residence and so on. Is that system still functional?
Yeah, and the reason for that, and there is because one of the things that the United States wants to ensure, which is really interesting because we do it both in regular immigration but also in refugee work, is that we get a mix of people. We have diversity here. We have the diversity visas and these things to make sure that we get people from all over the world. We don't just want people from Norway, which is, I mean, Norwegians are welcome.
Why would you leave Norway? They have a wonderful education system, free medical care.
But that's not the right question to ask. Is why the one that why don't we have more from Norway? That's not really not the way to go. So we try to make sure that we do get the diversity that makes this country vibrant. The same sort of thing goes on with refugee affairs, in which the United States, to the best of my knowledge, this is still current, is the only country that only has one requirement for refugee resettlement, other than that they are a conventional refugee, but all we look for is need. We don't go looking for the aerospace engineer who can immediately contribute to McDonnell Douglas. So when you look at who we resettle in the United States, compared to most of the other resettlement countries, we have more people who are truly vulnerable coming into this country. We bring in the people who are physically in some kind of bad shape, who have other serious problems. We bring in the single mother with 6 kids, which makes it rather difficult on the one hand, but the results have been truly inspirational. They've been outstanding, actually. And so that is one of the arrogancies, I guess, of the United States, is that, we're not going to cherry pick. We actually believe the Statue of Liberty thing, and we can't pick who's going to win and who's going to make it or who's not, who's going to be a genius and who's not. No, come on in and good luck, is how we do it, and it seems to work.
There's some research on that I want to talk about in a few minutes, but let's turn to you. What are your questions about this issue or related issues?
Thanks so much, Mr. Ambassador. So could you talk about areas that both parties agree upon for immigration reform?
Yeah, in the past, there was pretty good general agreement on most of these things. The bills weren't really contentious. They have become much more contentious over the past. Generally speaking, the areas of disagreement are numbers more than anything else. So I think in terms of the substance of composition of the immigrant choices, that stuff I don't think often gets an awful lot of disagreement from either party. So for instance, when we decided some years ago that we really had to plus up the number of refugees that we were bringing in from African countries that were grossly underrepresented, there was bipartisan support immediately for that. And we almost tripled the number of African refugees we brought in. So I don't think on the substantive level there's a tremendous amount of disagreement, which is what's really frustrating. So.
Thank you. Other questions? What's on your mind? Okay. Right here? Yeah, here, I'll give you mine.
Yes, I think Americans do agree with you. 70% favor immigration, but there's an adjective that to be added. I think it's legal immigration that people are concerned about because recently there were some special forces that dressed as civilians, and like you mentioned, the Darien Gap. They went down to the Darien Gap to see what the heck's going on down there because things are so out of control in the last couple of years. And these special forces said they noticed streams of Chinese military-aged males, and they said these guys were lit up, and they were aware of their environment and everything. He says they weren't just military age. They were saying these U.S. Special Forces said these were military guys. And he said there's thousands coming in. It takes $30,000 for them to come to Ecuador, another $10,000 to get with the coyotes. He said, who's paying for this? How do they get out of a totalitarian country? And there's like thousands of them coming in. So the last point is that they've been noticing the Border Patrol captured 8 Yemenis in one day that were on a terrorist list, and then MS-13 and sleeper cells, and then there's concerns about suitcase nukes coming in. So it's a mess. So I think there's a lot of variables to be taken into consideration now with this open border, because we're in an uncharted territory, and there's nefarious forces taking advantage of this situation, it appears.
Yeah, again, I'm not an advocate for open borders. I mean, I was saying, we have the sovereign right to control our border. There's no question about that. What we have to do is work to create the conditions under which we can effectively control the border, which we can't today, in my view, because we're not really addressing the migration issues. We're waiting till they become border issues, and then we start to address them. And that's way too late in the game. Then, I don't know anything about the Chinese issue, but then if there are problems, they're at your doorstep. And that's a different issue, which helps, I think, is my reaction initially to why I don't have the same immediate reaction. Because when I was standing in Kosovo looking at the little boy, I was focusing on him, right? I wasn't focusing on me. I was focusing on his welfare. When I'm standing at the border, I'm focusing on me. I'm focusing on my country's welfare. That's a very different issue. And it's time to move on to the welfare of migrants as well, which also helps us, I think, control the border. So that would be my approach.
Other questions? Yes.
Sir, thank you very much. Like you, I've served in Afghanistan and have friends who are there, and some made it over in the last kind of mass migration under Operations Allies Welcome. Is this a good instance where we brought thousands of Afghans, but now it's seemingly broken down, right? The U.S. doesn't appear to taking that next step to continue to welcome the Afghans, because legislation has broken down. It doesn't seem this didn't happen when people from Kosovo came over. I mean, is this just another indication of the problem we're having politically about migration or refugees?
Yeah, well, I mean, the situation in Afghanistan, I really think it points to the issue. And it's, in the case of Kosovo, what had happened was the refugees had arrived, and they were being housed in UNHCR camps, right? And so they had been scrutinized. They had already been registered, we knew who they were. They had been registered as refugees. And so it made our job through INS in those days, before we had a Department of Homeland Security, when they did the interview and the background check. This takes usually a long time to move a refugee through. There are just a ton of steps. This is not an avenue for your average terrorist to get in. They're the most scrutinized people that you can imagine. And so we knew who they were relatively, but what we did is we flew them over to the States and we housed them all at Fort Dix initially, where we continued to do our background work on them before they moved on to their resettlement locations. With the Afghans, we didn't have any of that capacity. We know who some are. Obviously, some worked for the United States, some worked for the military, but even that, the record keeping was not stellar. So a lot of people would come and say, well, I was an interpreter for Major Johnson in the 10th Mountain Division. Well, okay, show me some identification here. Were you really? And so it becomes a true mess. Furthermore, we don't really have the ability now inside of Afghanistan to do any sort of processing that you normally would, so we have to find alternative means of doing it. So they're very different situations, but it does show the importance, I think, of acting earlier in this whole cycle before you wait until it becomes a mad rush for the border. which is what we tend to be doing.
Let me ask what the role of the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees might be in this. That's a relatively well-funded international body, yet I don't hear much about their activity.
Yeah, well, they're the premier refugee agency, the principal sort of humanitarian response agency. Their convention mandate is really on the narrow legal definition of refugee, which is a person who's been persecuted on account of 5 covered bases. That's way too narrow because, for instance, if somebody is running away from, most Syrians, they weren't persecuted, right? Most Syrians were running away from violence. That doesn't make you a refugee under international law. That makes you a person running away from violence. There's no legal status for that person. So UNHCR has expanded just over the years its mandate to cover all of that. It's generally a fairly quiet operation, but they are the premier agency out there that is responding to all of these. And they work closely with International Organization for Migration and the International Committee for the Red Cross, which are sort of the 3 Geneva-based organizations that tend to take the lead on these humanitarian issues.
Any sense of how many people are coming under their purview?
Into the United States?
No, I'm thinking of the UN High Commissioner.
Yeah, I don't know. IOM estimates that there are about 30 million refugees in the world today, which is the highest at any time since the Second World War. So obviously they haven't touched all of them at this point. I don't have a reliable number to give you on that.
Questions? They're thinking. A fellow who teaches at George Mason University called Garrett Jones is an economist, but he studies the economies of nations dealing with migration. Mm-hmm. His work is pretty interesting, and if for a minute or so, if I could explain the question he asked. The fundamental question he was interested in dealt with economic and social success in a nation. Is it the people or is it the place? So he was measuring how close you were to the equator in your growing seasons and whether you had access to major rivers and deep water ports, that sort of thing. There's a whole list of those things. That's about the place. And then he was looking at the people. Are these unusually innovative or developmental kind of folks? And he came up with what he called an SAT score. S is for state. Do they have a stable set of courts and laws and jurisdictions? The A is agriculture. Can you feed yourself? Can you find food? And the T is technology. Do they devise things? Do they invent things? Or do they simply adopt something invented elsewhere? If you had a fairly high SAT score, you were likely to be a successful nation. Then he looked at migration. And the conclusion he came to was, it's not the place, it's the people. Mm-hmm. It's the people who can make a nation economically prosperous. And then he looked at what happened when people moved. And he categorized all of them by success. And if you move, Professor Jones said, you're likely to bring your skill set and your view of life with you to your new nation. Mm-hmm. And so he said the real danger for any nation is accepting people who have low SAT scores, who come from places that have no stable state, no stable agricultural system, and very little in the way of technology development. If you bring people from high development nations, they'll bring all of that with you. He stopped right there. He said, I don't offer political advice. Is that a roadmap for devising a quota system or a system of selection for migration?
Well, over the years, we've had quota systems for migration, and we've changed most of that over time. That has echoes of the way a number of countries do it. I mean, when they prioritize which countries they're going to bring in, either through their refugee programs or other programs. And we do to a certain extent. We have certain visa categories where we're trying to attract a certain skill set to the country. When I first joined the Foreign Service, one of the more interesting visas was for shepherds. They didn't have enough shepherds in Montana, so we had to issue visas to shepherds. So to a certain extent, they do that. But I think the reaction for most would once again be, no, let's not cherry pick. I don't know who's going to come up with the next great idea. I really don't know who it is. And it may not be the guy with the PhD or from a place that
It may not be
that.
the next Einstein.
Well, exactly. You just don't know what's going to happen. And so my personal preference would be to look again at making this country the most welcoming place we can while controlling, our sovereign right to sort of let people who want to come in here. The one thing to remember, I think, even about, as you're talking, I'm thinking about the Lost Boys of Sudan. We did a lot of work with the Lost Boys. They had nothing, right? You know who they were. They walked forever to get into mostly Tanzania and Kenya out of Sudan. Along the way, they created chess clubs. They created math societies. These were kids who had nothing. They wouldn't have passed this kind of probably this kind of a rating that anybody could come up with. I want them here. These are the kind of people that make this place work. And in general, people who are willing to put their lives out there like that are the same people that cross the plains in covered wagons. You want people that are willing to move and have that energy and that courage. And I think, I realize this is too long an answer, but I do think sometimes when we get too specific and look for certain skills and things, what we're doing, we're looking in the mirror and we're not really taking into account the unknown human genius that's out there. And I think we have to be open to that. And I think that's what makes the United States a little different, personally. So I would not be a big fan of the quota system.
It is interesting. I mean, in my own family, my great-grandfather emigrated from Ireland to the United States just following the famine. And he wrote back to his mother after taking a job on a potato farm in Westchester County, New York. He said, "The life I have is no better than the life I left. I'm moving on." And he moved to Chicago, and the city promptly burned down. And so he signed on with the railroads and went west. And that's how my grandfather, my father, and I grew up in Montana. And he was not trained as a railroad technician, but he became a track superintendent.
Not a shepherd.
Yeah, he did not become a shepherd. Once he had enough money, of course, he brought his family over and homesteaded. And there are literally hundreds of thousands of stories, if not millions, just like that. And you're right, it's hard to separate those out.
Yeah, I just think we enter dangerous territory when we decide that we know better than the universe knows. I think at some point you figure out your criteria in terms of numbers that you think you can support, that you want to be bringing in at a certain time, and then you hope that Emma Lazarus was right.
So I'm sure Anthony Blinken thinks about this with some regularity. Is the Department of State adequately funded and adequately staffed?
Well, as a State Department guy, or an ex-State Department guy, I will say absolutely not. But the question is, what would you do with more money, and what would you do with more staff? Now, in many embassies, the State Department contingent is one of the smaller parts of the embassy, in part because the work they do doesn't necessarily require an enormous presence. However, that does mean that since the State Department doesn't run a lot of programs and doesn't provide a lot of jobs, that the agencies who are better funded, DoD would be the principal one, tend to be the rulers of foreign policy. And State Department often is put into a let's catch up and try and make hay out of this thing role, rather than taking on its mandated role, which is to take the lead in foreign policy. Now, a lot of it depends on personalities, and DoD is only doing its job. This is not a hit on that, but it's just the way it is. If you want something done and you want it done quickly, you're probably going to go to DoD.
Yeah, I was in DoD and worked with and for Ambassador Mansfield for a while. And that's where you find arms and legs, and I would say, in all fairness, some smart folks.
Oh, absolutely.
Give
yeah.
them a task.
No question.
Yeah.
There is a difference, if you don't mind, if I can go off on that
ahead.
just a little bit. And I've used this example before, so some of you may have heard it, but when in Afghanistan in 2014 there was going to be a presidential election and we were going to try and have a smooth transition of power, we got very cryptic instructions from Washington, both the embassy and the ISAF guys. And initially, we had sort of a different take on what helping the elections to succeed would be. Some of our military planners, we're convinced that security is first and foremost the way you ensure that the election succeeds. You want to make sure people don't get killed going to the polling station. You want to make sure that the ballot boxes get delivered and are counted and all that stuff. So what does that mean? Well, that means troops and helicopters and all that kind of stuff. On our side, and this is all in the initial part, it all worked out quite well, but on our side, when we're sitting around trying to figure out what would make an election fail, we said, well, what makes an election fail is when the voters don't believe the outcome. We've seen that here, haven't we, to a certain extent. When there's doubt about the outcome, you've got major problems. Well, what would create doubt about the outcome in Afghanistan? A bunch of US soldiers running around with ballot boxes. That's probably not the best idea. Somebody would figure out that, or would think that we'd stuffed it because we had a favorite candidate. So we got together and we worked out the arrangements, and that day, election day, went about as well as you could expect. But there's a very different mindset in the agencies about the same issues. So that's why it's important to get you together, because you have a richer response when you do it together. But if one completely outweighs the other, you might be leaning too heavily in this case, into the military side and not heavily enough into the diplomatic side. And in some cases, vice versa.
What's on your minds? Make it brief. Thank you.
This is really brief. When people are wanting to apply for refugee status, is an international law that they have to apply in the country next to where they're from, or rather than just rushing up to the border?
Yeah, you're supposed, I mean, the way the law is written, and in practice things don't always work the way the textbook says they're going to work, but the way the law is written, what you're supposed to do is request asylum or refugee status in the first country of the border that you cross. So technically, if you wanted to play that game, many of the migrants at the southern border of the United States shouldn't be there. They should have applied for it in Panama or Costa Rica or Nicaragua or someplace else, right? That's what I said. That's the story I gave them, and then just shoving them to our border. That's the reality, though. That's what happens in a case like this. Asylum happens when you are in a country and you request asylum. Refugee status is when you're outside of a country requesting status in the other country. Now, the UNHCR is the usual agency that says, yeah, that person's a refugee, and this person's not a refugee. And we generally abide by what they say. We also have the right to determine who we think is a refugee. So we're not dictated to by UNHCR, but we are the major donor of UNHCR, and we work very closely with them. So, technically, yes, you should apply at the first border you cross. But in reality, that's not how it works very often.
Well, that's the S part of the SAT score.
Right.
Is the state stable? Do they have the assets? Do they have the structures, rules, courts,
Right.
and the ability to assist?
Mm-hmm.
And in many cases,
And the
in
will.
that part of the world at least, the answer is clearly no.
Right.
Yeah. So let me go back to you one more time. We've got a little bit of time remaining. Do you have a question? Those questions will occur to them
It's close to
on
summertime.
the
I
way
think that's
back to the dorm or on the way to the dining hall. Ladies and gentlemen, David Robinson.
Thank you all very much.